Hello, everybody, and welcome to the live stream. So today, let me get my lights on real quick. I'll get that video a little bit better. Just a second. All right, and here we are, and welcome to the Sunday live stream, where I want to review some basic ideas about the permaculture design process, and then we will hop into a discussion of the zones, and then a question that we had from Jason over on the podcast Discord. So let me pull that up real quick so I have his question for here in a bit. And then we will get into this. So I wanted to get into these basics of design, both as a review for myself and to walk through this process of what permaculture design looks like from some of the physical practices that we engage in order to put together what we need to kind of design from, and to start with the basics. I'm assuming that you have a basic understanding or a core understanding of the ethics and principles of permaculture that we're going to be building the rest of these pieces on top of. If not, certainly drop that in the chat and let me know, and then I can do a review about those in the future. But this is more about the physical design process. And hello, Bless, glad to have you here. And some of the things that I go through whenever I'm walking the land or starting with my own project or with a client or customer. If someone sits down with me for a consultation, this is going to be, some of the basic things that we're going to start with. So when it comes to a base map, I see this as a document that we're going to begin with and use to work up from. It's about creating a sketch and getting an idea of what's on the ground and already exists. It's not something that I think that needs to be necessarily to scale, but rather can be something abstract as well, depending on what it is that we're trying to track and work on. And then once we have that base idea and have started to put some pieces onto that map, then that we will develop over time and be able to get more precise and include ever more detail on. But in the very beginning, when we're getting started, for me, a base map is just kind of an outline to work from. And today I want to try something a little bit different. I have a second camera set up, so then that allows me to show my workspace here in my office and put some things together for you to see kind of live and on the go, and to draw out a base map as a sketch in the way that I would put something like this together if I were sitting at a client's table. First we would sit down and articulate their goals and write those down. And so, maybe on my document I might have, that they're interested in a food forest, keeping chickens, developing a garden, rain barrels, and then also, some goals. If we've walked the land, then what is it that is already existing? Maybe they have some raised beds, they have a compost pile, maybe their children garden with them, and so that they already have a children's garden. And so those are some things that I want to include. But then also, from having done this walkthrough, are there any key specimens that are already there? So, there's a property that I think of, that I know of, that has some willows that are already there. They have some brambles and berries. And then they also have some white pines and white oak. Then, do they have any buildings? So usually, you might have a house, a detached garage. The property I'm thinking of had a pole building on it, which was just kind of a roof put up on top of some poles. And then, hey, Garden of Whedon, welcome from Australia. Thanks for joining us. Let's see if I can get this to refocus. So then, once I have some of these pieces out, then what my base map is going to look like is, draw a basic outline of the property. Again, like I say, this is one that I've worked on before. So they've got a garage. That's connected by a little breezeway. They've got a house. On the back of that house is a deck. And then the yard kind of goes and does. It looks kind of like this. And so, this is what my initial base map would look like. I've got a rough idea of what the property looks like. I have the major buildings outlined. And then once these big features are in, I kind of work from that larger area down. And so, like on this particular place, there are some stairs here. This children's garden that I mentioned is here. So I've got their CG. Their compost pile is over here. And then the front yard had a series of raised beds. So those are my raised beds. Over here is this pole building that I mentioned. In front of that is our white pine. Then there's a large oak. That white oak sits off this deck. And then over here is just a big swath of brambles that kind of form a natural wall. And then back along the property, flowing in some natural banks, is a stream. And so, like this, and then there's the willows kind of form this clump. And now I might go in and add some color to this to make certain things stand out, color code some of these items here. But after walking the land, this is the kind of base map that I would develop. And I can use something like this for like 90% of the work that I would do when it comes to a permaculture design, because then once we have this together to build on top of it, I might say, okay, so we've got these willows here, we have the stream, and thinking about where we would want to place things in relationship to where we go often, talk with the family. Where are you on most of your days? And this will get into the zone model that we'll touch on here in a moment. But taking this just kind of a sketch, I like taking pictures of these, with my cell phone or a digital camera or something, because then if I have a picture of this base map, I can just run off copies and print them to a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper and just mark up on top of this a lot of different ideas. I have a client who I'm working with right now who is trying to simplify their backyard garden because the home that they purchased was designed and developed by the head of their local horticulture society, and so is this beautiful forest style garden, but it doesn't have like the food forest functionality that we would have as permaculture practitioners. So they want to go back in and find ways to simplify the management of that land. And so once I have a base map of their land worked up, which I can share that with you in another one of these design conversations in the future, build on this example with another project that's live. They're trying to figure out how do they manage it more easily. How do they take something that is really gorgeous and in depth, but that they don't have the necessarily, the knowledge that the president of the horticulture society had in order to develop up what it was that that they had and that they were working on. And because now that's kind of a management issue for them, simplifying it so that they can enjoy this property and use it in their own way while leaving as much of what is there, what is intact, that's already there. But yeah, something like this, I think back to the interview with Owen Wormser about his work for Lawns into Meadows, and that what I frequently see with permaculture design is that the focus becomes super, super deep on what it means to create like a perfect permaculture design. And unless you come from a background in landscape architecture and have a lot of those drafting and other skills, largely what we do as permaculture practitioners doesn't require that kind of minutia. One of the things that I'd like to do in one of these live streams in the future is to talk about different design methodologies, such as incremental design, random assemblage, and some of the other techniques and strategies that I enjoy for like building up from something like this to be able to include these goals that a client has and kind of like push those edges and make it more functional and useful for them. There are lots of different ways that we can get from a base map like this to a permaculture design, and don't necessarily need to create something that accounts for every square inch. And like, what does that look like, and what are the different ways that we can relay that kind of information? Bless asks, was it all annual garden? No, this was designed as a presentation garden and more to show what you could do with heavy shade. Looking at the pictures that were shared with me, this is remote consultation that I'm doing for a family friend. The images that they shared are of a deeply, heavily shaded area. And so, they're growing a lot of hostas and other greens that are really good in those edge spaces. And now we're talking about, how can we go through and open up perhaps some of that canopy by removing some of the younger to medium age trees in order to put in some food if they would like to put in some dwarf fruit trees that might exist in a space like that. Because of where they're located is within the growing area for pawpaws. And so, pawpaws would be a great introduction for the space as it already exists. This family friend is not a permaculture practitioner, and so I'm trying to blend their goals with some of these ideas of permaculture and knowledge of how to use spaces that are, already designed or exist in a way that have a different function in order to move them into, trying to retain as much of that function as already exists because of all of the embodied energy that has gone into planting these trees and developing these gardens. And so, what can we do to create the most change with the least amount of energy and with the least amount of modification to what's already there? But also, like, coming from a permaculture perspective, something that I think is different about that is that we don't also necessarily need to be talking about like tearing everything out and creating a more traditional garden, because a lot of the stuff that's already planted there is edible. And so, talking about what are their long term food goals, and would they want to learn about some of these non traditional foods, and, the fact that something like a hosta is completely edible. And so then it's less about introducing things that are new, but instead talking about how to best use what's already there. And, pointing to things like Dina Falcone's Foraging and Feasting, which talks about, pot herbs and cooking some of those other things. But yeah, this is one of the things that I enjoy as someone who loves permaculture and permaculture design is like, what are the ways that we can kind of flip this script so that it's not just about coming in and creating something that we've already seen before, but the land as it is and what we can do to, yeah, develop edges and push them, to change the vision that we might have, because the imagination that we can bring to a project. So, but back to our conversation for today about design and our beginning design methodologies. Once you have this base map, I think one of the other things that's really important to consider as we look at this is the zone model within permaculture. And that zone model traditionally was an idea of 5 zones, 1 through 5. And you have, in some of the discourse, this idea of zones of use. And so, 1 is, and zones of use is also around like how frequently we visit an area, and we're initially really deep into gardening and how we would design our garden. But over time, those zones have been expanded so that you have a zone 6, which represents, the biosphere as a whole and the ways in which that biosphere influences the space where we live. And this will get to a question that I'll be addressing later, that Jason shared with us about designing for climate change. And so, needing to be aware of the way in which the world as a whole impacts where we live. And so, for me in this space here, when I think about this stream and what was shared with me, the people who lived there had to deal with seasonal flooding. And so, what does that look like as there's more moisture in the air? What kind of additional flooding might occur? How might the flooding change in its seasonality? And if this becomes warmer, are there going to be more plants that are growing up that could actually decrease the amount of water getting to the stream? And so I'm really happy that this idea of a zone 6 for our biosphere has been added to the conversation, because as the world continues to change, I think it's really important to have that context in our back pocket as part of our design considerations. 2 other zones that have been added are 0, which represents the space where we live, and then 0, which represents ourself. And I'm glad also that these are added, because as permaculture has expanded, I think it's really important to think about ourselves and our context when it comes to our place in the permaculture community and for permaculture design. It's really important, I think, to do a self audit or a self assessment and understand the places where our strengths are and what our life and lifestyle bring to our ability to design and what it is that we're good at. I joke that the things that I'm really good at growing are children, strawberries, garlic, and cats. And so knowing that I am not going to be someone who is out doing a lot of like farming when it comes to permaculture. As I dig into my love of like storytelling and teaching, that's kind of the edge that I ride as a community member within this. And so I'm more than happy to garden and help provide calories for my family, but I don't know that I'm ever going to be in a place where I am growing a vast majority of the calories that my family eats. I like to forage and teach foraging, especially, in an urban environment, and taking on some of the things that Sarah Beer talked about in our interview together. And for the food, I think it's the Food Forager's Companion, was the title for her book. But, looking for food in spaces that we might not think about. The fact that all throughout here in Falls Church there are tons of hostas. And though, no, they have not been improved for food, they are something that is edible and that we can consider then if we need calories in our diet. And so, going around and looking at what is around, and, looking in backyards and over fences. There are some trees one of my neighbors here in the community has that are mulberries, and those are growing over the edge, and knowing that those are there. But those are the kinds of things that I think about for myself. Like, I like living in places that are walkable. I spend a lot of time on foot, and so that's part of my personal assessment of where I come from as a permaculture designer, and the awareness that I'm going to have of the broader area around me. Wanting to use the resources that I have to support the local farmers market, to encourage them to continue farming, because that's something that I can do. And yeah, being aware of our limitations is something that I think is super important. And part of what I have planned for the next of these conversations when it comes to permaculture design, from my own permaculture design course, once we were through kind of like talking about base maps and zones, we talked about sectors and vectors. And so that's one of the conversations that I want to have next time, because those are things that we can also include in our personal dialogue. And so then the other part of that zones is, our home, where we live, whether that's an apartment, a tent on one of our friends' backyards, a tiny home on a trailer that we move around, being aware of what is within the space immediately around us and what we can do with it. Can we be preserving food, storing food, saving food? I think of this indoor space as also one where the ideas of the 5 R's of refuse, reduce, reuse, repair, recycle are really important, because that's likely where we're going to have a workbench or a kitchen table where we can be sitting down and repairing objects, where we can be putting our plans together when it comes to food, or making decisions as a family or as an individual to sit down and make a plan about what we will bring into our home, and how we can refuse to bring in certain waste, how we can decide to really engage in classic home economics, and being able to really understand where our resources flow in and out of our lives, and the impact that that has on our ability to create change. Yeah, I think that idea of working from our self outward, from the smallest zone outward, and then seeing the impacts of the largest zone down, really makes this zone model really important. To begin with a self, something that was added later, and then to look at our home and get our self in order, our home in order, and then look at each of these other permaculture zones out from us. Because after we move from our home directly and we move to zone 1, that zone 1 is somewhere that we go to and pass through regularly every day. And so one thing I also do like to mark on my base maps is the direction of the sun, and then also north or south, depending on whether we live in the northern or southern hemisphere. So like this place, I can just add a quick little N, because I know that north is about in that direction. And then as a result of that my sun comes from this angle. And then, as I say, as over time, we will build up on top of this base map. And so today, let me grab my colored pencils, and then what I will do is create another legend over here for my zone 0, 1, 3, zone 4, and zone 5. So, let me grab these. We'll see how these show up on camera. Part of my art kit, which is also part of my design kit. We'll grab a couple of the brighter colors here and play a little. Yeah, I guess one of these times I should also take you through my design kit and all the things that I have, because as much as I like digital tools and our ability to communicate, to have conversations like this, using Zoom to talk with people all over the world, having clients be able to meet with me, send me pictures and things like that, I still do most of my design work on paper. And so that's where putting things like this together come in. And I have a ton of stuff that I pull from depending on what I've got going on. Oh, good, this shows up better on camera. So, and then we'll continue the discussion of zones. Now, one of the things about it that I'll show here in a moment is that this property actually does not have all the zones available to it. So for them, this is kind of where our zone map for this property would end. But then I can think about, we can theorize a little about how we might work on this otherwise. But so, as I say, for this space, there's a garage that these folks are in regularly as they come and go about their day. Here is their home, of course, that they are in. And so, I have zone 0 accounted for. Then for zone 1, this zone 1 is, a place where we go to or pass through regularly, often every day. I've had it described as front door to car door, or a balcony where we might have window boxes, or our regular garden space. And so, for these folks, this is actually an overhang, so there's a front porch here. Front door is here, so there's a lot of traffic of, in and out. So we can map some traffic flows. But knowing this, and then in conversation, this children's garden is a place where they are every day. These raised beds. And then, because they go down the stairs, and then also time in the driveway, because the children play there, and then because they visit their compost bin often to drop off, that these are the spaces that this family uses regularly. And so because of that, when I'm thinking about some of, developing their gardens more, where they want to put rain barrels, this zone map that I'm putting together, is where I'll start thinking about these goals and where their zones of use might be and where they're going to spend their time. And as a result, then where are we going to locate some of these ideas? And then so within this zone model of permaculture, as I say, they are about areas that we frequent or use regularly. And so, let me review the zones since I have them down here. We did zone 0, the self, zone 0 as the home. Zone 1 represents where we are regularly. Zone 2 is an area that we would still, go to frequently, but might not manage or travel through as intensively. And this is a good place for, maybe once or twice a day. So if we're going to be growing berry bushes and things that may need tended somewhat regularly, because we might put bird netting on them. If we're not growing a whole lot and want to make sure we harvest them, if we're going to be have plants that are going to need to be harvested from, maybe daily throughout the season, but we wouldn't be picking from morning and night, they can go into zone 2. Zone 3 is an area that we would visit and manage less intensively, occasionally visited, maybe every 2 to 3 days, 2 to 3 times a week. But is a place that we would have under management. Zone 3 is a place for larger animals. Zone 2 is where we might put smaller animals like chickens, ducks, rabbits. But yeah, Zone 3, as I say, pastures, food forests. Or if we have, if we grow a large amount of a seasonal crop that doesn't need regular management, isn't part of our garden, like this is a place where I think of for things like corn, fall squashes, pieces like that. And then Zone 4 is our near wild. These are places that we visit infrequently, once a week, once a month. They may be managed or tended, but they're not spaces that we necessarily actively design for, but we want to have in consideration for part of our part of our overall design, because we might want to, if we have a space that is near a Zone 3 that is semi-wild, wanting to make sure that there's a wildlife corridor there, or to maintain a wildlife corridor. Zone 5 is a wild or conserved area that we might visit, but we don't take things from. We leave it alone. In some of my other conversations, I've been a bit more vociferous about how much we need to leave alone in this zone. One of my permaculture teachers, Ben Weiss, talks about Zone 5 and questions whether or not there are any places that are truly wild anymore. And I understand that perspective, but I look at it from where we're currently at and the places that we might want to leave wild or return to wild, and so we're not necessarily going to manage them, but instead try to take care of these other zones in these places for human use so that these areas can return to a semi-wild state. We could get into a longer conversation about like novel ecosystems and other things that might emerge in Zone 5, and how we might want to manage them, but I think that that's a higher level discussion than what we're looking at here today. So yeah, looking at this area and how the family uses it, I should probably color this in. So where is this family regularly? For the Zone 2 idea of, this deck for cooking or for sitting out at night. My understanding was that the children would commonly play in this area. And to some degree in this pole building. And then also there is something I did not put. There's a clothesline here that is used regularly because there's another door on the house. So there's this other flow of traffic. And so this kind of becomes our Zone 2 from conversation with the family about how they use the land and from our walk. But then from there, these other spaces are just not used as frequently and would be, as we say, as we develop this idea, a good area for some of these other ideas that we articulated in their goals. And so this becomes our Zone 3. And then also, because this is not a space that is used that often, we can designate this Zone 3 and this as well. Now I guess we could, if we wanted to, designate like this stream as a Zone 4. Oh, yeah. Arif, go ahead. What's your question? And yeah, bless. It's one of the things that really gets me is like even in my apartment, living in an urban space without a green area, that this is the kind of the zone model you can really drill down in or expand out. And I can apply these ideas, which is another conversation we get into, is that these zones, we use it in the landscape because the landscape is an easy place to model and discuss these ideas. But we can also use them when it comes to our social context. And we can map, our circles of influence because of who we spend time with. I can map out zone models within my own community of where I walk and spend time frequently. I could pull a Google map and print it out again because I like working with paper of where I live in Falls Church, and I can do zones of like what are the restaurants that my wife and I frequent. Where does that take us through in our community? I can map the places that I don't go and decide where I want to visit more frequently, how I want to change my own influence over a space. And that's why, as when I introduced the idea of a base map, is that our maps can be abstract. And that's where I like mind maps, which is one of the strategies and techniques that I use when it comes to actual on the ground design. Arif, then your question is, I want to buy land, which is best, flat land or rough land, and what are the advantages and disadvantages? If I were someone without permaculture knowledge or interest, I would buy the land that would be easiest for me to manage. And so I would probably look for something that is relatively flat, that has, if I have the ability to place myself within a bioregion and I know where, there's land that is known for being deep and fertile, and where there is sufficient rainfall for the kinds of things that I want to grow, that is what I would look for. And I would make a list of all of what I want to do. And so that's where like this goals articulation of like the idea of a food forest and wanting to keep chickens and things like that, wanting to be very clear on what it is that I want to accomplish. And, even if I can say I don't know, is perfectly acceptable. I think flatland is great because, any precipitation that falls on it, you know where it's going to go. Some of the disadvantages of something like that, though, is that flatland is harder to move moisture through and put it where we need it. I was having a conversation with an upcoming guest for the show, Jesse Frost, about land and some of the decisions we might make when we're purchasing, and that very often it's easy to look at a large piece of property and think that we're going to be able to do so many amazing things with it, when really, when it comes to doing a lot of this work as a permaculture practitioner, most of the really integrated permaculture farms that I'm aware of are 5 acres or less. They usually have half to an acre that is under really intensive cultivation, and then the rest is where they're pulling in their fertility because they're growing some green manures that they're going to chop and bring in and drop, depending on how their land is laid out. And I could get really deep into this question, Arif. Like, I think that I should really like make this a live stream in and of itself. The short answer is, though, that land is easier to mechanize, or flat land is easier to mechanize if you want to. It's easier to bring equipment onto. It's easier if you have any mobility issues to be able to move across. There aren't, in my mind, what I don't like about flatland is that it's harder to make use of gravity, and to be able to move resources around for us. It's harder to, like, there are very often on flatland less pre-existing microclimates, because even on just some rolling land, you have places that the sun is going to hit earlier, and so that's going to warm up earlier in the day. The sun's going to hit it later in the day, and so there's going to be more use of the sun in that space, while at the same time you know that based on where your sun movement is, you're going to have dips, and so that becomes shade. That's also space where you can channel moisture to. If you have a wet-loving plant, you already have something that's pre-existing that you can plant in where that moisture is going to go to. If you have a plant that wants dry feet, you can plant it on the top of one of those rolling spaces because the water table is going to be lower there. From a permaculture perspective, I prefer rough land. I want spaces other people don't want to go to, because when we look at the larger context of like land access, land that other people don't want because it's shadier or rougher or harder to move across, like that's prime for permaculture practitioners. and it's, as I say, around the spaces that I'm used to, it's also super cheap, um, and like substantially cheaper, and provides us a lot of opportunities to improve it. If you're really DIY, land that is unimproved may already have wood on it, trees that you can drop and use for building your outbuildings, putting together, and building shelter. Um, and just, yeah, like you can really apply everything that permaculture has to offer on unimproved land in a way that you can't elsewhere. And it's, yeah, there are a lot of philosophical questions that come up with this, and ethical considerations as permaculture practitioners. Um, when I think about this, like the type of land that we should be looking for, um, there's a conversation about, uh, land that doesn't need us. And I was in Lancaster County um, for a while. And Lancaster County, Pennsylvania is the I forget the exact description, but we were having a conversation about this yesterday with some friends who grew up in Lancaster and have family who have been there for centuries. Is, if I remember right, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania is the richest farmland in the United States that does not require irrigation. The area gets, last I looked it up, between like 45 and 50 inches of rainfall equivalent a year. The soil is deep, and you just don't need to do much with it. But farmland there can run you $1 million an acre. And for a while, there were developers, though, who were willing to pay that kind of money to put in luxury developments, luxury townhomes and things. And so a lot of that land disappeared. And to me, it's such a shame, because I'd like to get farmers who are really interested in that kind of stuff on the land. Um, Eco Islands mentions that, reclaimed mine land is super cheap, and there's lots of it in central Pennsylvania. And yeah, that stuff's great. If you're on something that has a lot of the backfill from the mine, there's all kinds of things you can do to develop that soil. Um, and yeah, thinking about like land prices, my wife just found a building lot, and we were excited because at first we thought it was actually property for sale, and it was $300,000 for 6,000 square feet of undeveloped land. You extrapolate that out to an acre at around 45,000 square feet, and you are looking at about $2 million for an acre of land if you could get it. Um, but yeah, like this undeveloped land is just perfect for permaculture practitioners. Who cares if something is on a slope? Because you can terrace paths to get to your trees and just plant your trees on those slopes. What we have about what we can do with mulch to capture moisture, all the stuff that Brad Lancaster talks about in his books are amazing. And so we can apply all those kinds of things to those spaces, and really be able to make use of that land and be able to bring all of our imagination to bear and really show people what it is that we can do with this stuff that people consider marginal and not useful. And so for me, yeah, definitely go for that kind of land that other people aren't interested in. You will find that as you creatively apply these ideas that there are far more advantages than disadvantages. um, and yeah, like I even think about stuff that is on the lee side of a mountain that doesn't get a lot of sun. Like there's stuff that we can do with that as permaculture practitioners that other people wouldn't even think about touching. um, and that there's all kinds of production opportunities for mushrooms and things like that. Let me put that in the queue that we would do another conversation about flat versus rough land, as one of these conversations, and I'll dig into it a lot deeper. Um, do do do. When it comes to Zone 4 and that near wild, one of the books that I really like to recommend for anybody who's interested in these ideas is M. Cat Anderson's Tending the Wild. There's a lot of information that she shares that gets into the ways that we can like tend to the space around us. Her work focuses on historical indigenous techniques in the Pacific Northwest. If my memory's wrong, I'm sorry, it's been a number of years since I read her work. Really, really useful to get us thinking about the ways that we can be in spaces and tend to them without necessarily deeply designing for them. And that's one of the things that I really would like to get more people to be talking about, is moving away from having to manage, tend, and design everything. Like, let's really focus on small spaces, because the numbers that we get from like Steve Solomon in Gardening When It Counts, from a lot of what I've read from what's happening in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, and from not natural gardeners, like master gardeners, from permaculture farmers like Holly Brown at Island Creek Farm in Western Virginia, is that we can grow a lot of food on very small spaces. When we look at doing a lot of the integrated things that permaculture provides for us, and many of the other techniques that we're learning more and more about, like, forested pigs, doing mushrooms, pastured pigs, a lot of these other management techniques, when we compare them to monocrop, we are not going to create the same number of calories from any given permaculture crop. But what we can do is integrate a lot of different crops into an area and be able to then harvest such a huge variety of calories that in the end, very often, we can outproduce monocrops in aggregate over time. And when it comes to or if you can drop me an email at show@thepermaculturepodcast.com, I can get you some more resources for that. Some other farms that would be worth getting in touch with, who I know that are practicing permaculture, that may be able to accommodate long-term space, like long-term opportunities. I know a couple that do like at least like a complete growing season. That might be of interest. So if you want to drop me some information about that. With everything we've gone through, oh, the last thought on like the amount of food that we can grow on acreage, with techniques like market gardening, forest farming, silvopasture, and a lot of the other things that come out of permaculture, is that a single acre in a temperate climate can provide diet for a whole diet for 4 to 10 people. And that's without actually growing on every square inch. But it works out to be about 1,600 square feet per person is the back of the envelope math as growing space. And then the rest of that space is for your on property fertility. And so, for a family of 4 with an acre, you should be able, after a couple of years of development, to be able to create a whole food diet in that space. But again, we live in a time in a society where that requires 1 or 2 people to be doing that full time as their only engagement. And then the less time that we have to do that, the more that we kind of have to pull back realistically on the amount of calories that we can bring out of a space. My permaculture teacher, Ben Weiss, when I took my PDC with him in 2010, they were farming on, I think it was an acre and a half of kind of undeveloped land by hand. And they put in their swales by hand, they did their raised beds by hand with hose and things like that. And he said that with, I think it was him and two farm interns, so 3 of them, the 3 of them were just able to manage a little over of an acre in order to grow on, even though a lot of the space that they were growing in was not actually, in production. By the time they did their pads and everything else, they had a half to 3/4 that was actually planted, but even that was quite a lot of work for them. We get into, that's another conversation for another day. I was going to get into the lives of medieval peasants, and what like subsistence farming can look like in practice compared to where we are currently as a society. But there's, there are a lot of pieces of this to make it work that we have to shift away from the societal expectations that we currently have. And I was having a conversation with my wife this morning about all the unpaid labor that goes into running a household that we don't often discuss. And, if someone in your family is growing food, that's labor that we need to account for in our conversations of the home economy. Stay at home parents do a ton of work. And when I looked at some of, there's an article that circulates every year or so about like if someone in a household was actually paid for all the labor that they do when it comes to like grocery shopping and cooking and childcare and all these other things, that it's an incredibly valuable part of our daily lives. And so as permaculture practitioners, what are ways that we can shift some of our labor back to this kind of economy? I think about Ben Falk mentions it in his book about if you spend $20 on a great apple tree that is well established on good rootstock and you plant it, you're going to be able to harvest apples from that tree for 20 or 30 years. What does 10 or 15 pounds of apples every year from your orchard look like? And the what that returns to your family compared to putting that $20 into a financial investment. And I I think that within our society, those are that we have to, as much as I hate from like an ecosystem management perspective talking about the value, quote unquote, of ecosystem services, sometimes that's the way that we need to talk about it, because those dollars and cents make sense to people, and help us kind of like dig into the conversation and make this more accessible to people about like why would we spend our time or resources in these different areas. Yeah, and bless, I mean, that's my thing. Running the podcast, doing these live streams, everything that I produce within the permaculture realm, I've talked at length about from a financial perspective. I've lived beneath the poverty line for a long time, financially, like as a number on paper perspective. But I spent a number of years as a full time father. I was a stay at home dad when my children were first born. I was doing a lot of the things that are necessary to run a household and be able to like reduce the stress for a family and to keep things, flowing smoothly. And that's kind of like even now the place that I'm in, even as I grow what it is that I'm doing with the show and offering meanderings and consultations and the storytelling for personal transformation class and all these other things. One of the things that I still value, even though like on paper my financial income is nowhere near many of my friends and colleagues, is just that I value the ability to have that flexibility and that time to take care of all of those other things, because it leaves the evenings free to play video games with my children or break out board games, or for my wife and I to cook dinner together. And that's where I think we need to, like I say, just shift a lot of this conversation towards what do we really need as individuals. And that goes back to that zone 00 self-assessment. And it's, what do I need in my day? And I think about what Ethan Hughes talked about when it comes to, some of his friends who downgrade from a giant luxury SUV to a luxury sports car, and it saves them a mile per gallon. That is an improvement on their environmental footprint. It might not be as far as where we might want to take it, but it's still an improvement and an important conversation to have. And so, when we do that assessment, does having a sports car matter to you? And if it does, that's okay. I find that permaculture is not one about like needing to be, if we're going to have abundance in the garden in our lives, we need to make sure that we have abundance in our lives. and that abundance looks the way that we want it to, and working towards those goals. So yeah, that's where that self-assessment I think is really important. Um, yeah, but I hope that this like sketch of a base map and color coding makes sense, as a way to quickly be able to develop and get some ideas onto paper. As you saw, even while talking with you, this came together in a couple of minutes. And this is exactly what I like about this kind of method, is because we can put something functional together in an hour, um, for ourselves, for clients if we're doing this professionally, and kind of step away from needing to put in hours and hours of work. I think from a professional perspective, this is important because it makes permaculture more affordable to clients, and it makes it accessible because they can see this come together while you're sitting with them. You know, I don't want to design when I'm with a client, especially for an initial conversation when we're doing an intake assessment. So that's why, like, I don't want to put a food forest on here and start drawing that in. But by saying, zone 3 is where we might normally put a food forest, and so this is where I'm thinking you have a zone 3, that we can at least begin thinking about what this looks like and how it comes together for them. And be able to say, okay, well, because you like a garden, maybe we can expand these raised beds. Your driveway here, maybe we could talk about putting some, beds on legs here on an unused section of the driveway if it gets good sunlight. Um, but this is my very basic base map. Before we would add anything else to this in this conversation, I'd want to have a conversation about sectors and vectors, because that's where we're going to start talking about the influences on this site. And so that will be the next design, live stream, which I'll do in another week, but more on that in a little bit. Um, there was a question that came in on the Discord from Jason. I want to address that here in a moment, but real quick, let me take a 2-minute break, grab a drink, and I will be right back with you. So hang in there, and we'll be right back. All right, everybody, I am back. Let me make sure my levels are good after setting on mute there. Um, do do do. Um, Bless, I see your question there. Would a consultation be beneficial for someone who has already begun designing themselves? Um, no, I think a consultation or a conversation, it does. You could have a complete design and still want to sit down and have a second set of eyes on it. Um, like I've spent a decade doing this, but everything that I know is just my own eyes and my own work. And so I think that it's helpful to sit down and talk with somebody else to share what it is that we're doing and get a different perspective. I've lived in the mid Atlantic for most of my life. I've largely visited permaculture farms on the East Coast. So, to go back to that phrase I was using earlier, I have a particular context in which all of my permaculture design work comes from. And so that's, my own perspective. And so, you know, sit down, hash things out, look at what it is that you've already done, look at where you want to take things. One of the things that I like about permaculture, again, because of this abundance model, is that our answer to most of our questions is that it depends. And so I don't think that sometimes we get caught up in what the language of what is right and what is wrong. And because of as long there are certain things that I don't like right or wrong language. I like talking about what works best for us, what is good for us, and what satisfies what our needs are and how it all comes together and where we're coming from. Because permaculture as a practice is really about the ethics to me and the prime directive, which I've got a video that I'm working on, which is about that idea of permaculture in 4 questions. And that, if you're taking responsibility for yourself as best you can and for those people who you care about, in Bill Mollison's original declaration of the prime directive, it was taking responsibility for your own life and that of your descendants. Not everybody has children or people who they would consider their descendants, but if we think about that collectively, the people around us who we care about, folks who we're in interaction with regularly, however we want to define, ourselves and the people who are close to us and our future generations, that's the key point. And from there, that's what the rest of this descends from, is what are the best ways that we can do that? So how can we care for Earth? And what are we doing caring for Earth? Is what are we doing something where we're trying to care for ourselves and people? Because ultimately permaculture design, as much as I love a lot of the books and conversation about the way that permaculture can be used to restore ecosystems, my preference is still to design human spaces with it and to leave ecosystems alone as much as possible. That if we do the things that care for Earth and ourselves, and we're creating a surplus that cares for the other than human, then that's caring for the little piece of the world that we're a part of and does give back and helps to meet those other needs. Many of our food crops are also pollinators, and so provide for our pollinators. If we're moving away from monocrops and doing integrated agriculture, whether that's market gardening, a food forest, or anything like that, if we're planting flowers in our garden that provide for pollinators, that's giving back. If we're planting an extra tomato an extra tomato or two, or a spare zucchini to give to our neighbors, or to make sure that our groundhog has something to eat, those are all valid ways to practice permaculture and to give back. And that's where, for me, as long as we're answering those questions and working towards them, that's what really matters. And we all, the fourth part of that, of the ethics for me, or the fifth part of practicing permaculture in four parts, 4 questions, is understanding that we're in a period of transition. I don't know if you're much of a television watcher, but my wife introduced me to The Good Place, and we binged that, during quarantine. And one of the conversations that arises in that show is the fact that, everything that we do is kind of a cursed decision because of the society we live in and the world as it is. Almost anything we do is going to be harmful in some way. And it's reconciling that. It's understanding that, as much as we may want to avoid something like Amazon because we don't like their labor practices, that something like that can be difficult because we don't have the time to find like the perfect product that satisfies our life, but we need something. And so it's, what's the least harm that we can do? What's the best way that we can do something that gives back? And if that means that, we make a decision that is harmful in one way, but that frees up resources for us to do something more, then that's okay to me, right now. I would still love to live in a close knit community with people who I love and care about, to recreate a village that are houses that would degrade in, a couple of years if they weren't maintained, but that still has Wi-Fi, and tools that would last for generations because they are well built and everybody in the community knows how to repair them. But that's not where I'm at. And sometimes because we don't know the quality of a tool or something like that, that means we're going to have to buy twice, and that just happens. Before I go any much further on that, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to drop them, before we bring this live stream to a close. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I want to get to Jason's question, and use that as some time for your folks to do that if you have anything. But in the Patreon Discord, Jason of the Fifth World asked, how can we keep our design methods up to date with the moving ecological target that climate change presents? There's kind of two parts of this for me, and one of them is that the methods of permaculture as they exist work perfectly fine for climate change and everything that we have that's coming. I may be a little biased there, I will admit, because of sitting in the host seat of this show for so long. I've been exposed to many different ideas about permaculture, who's teaching what, where it's going, what we can expect, and some of the conversations that folks are having around these ideas. And so more and more people are including the conversation about climate change and what to expect in the future into their dialogues about permaculture education. I think that if you've gone through a PDC and have been applying the ideas of permaculture for a couple of years, as they are, they're good. Like, everything still applies in a changing world. We're still going to want to be harvesting water. We're still going to want to be, growing as many calories as we can from the landscape. We're still going to want to be building community. All of that still applies. All the techniques, I feel, are still valid because the PDC, as outlined by Bill Mollison, applies to ecosystems all over the world, from cold deserts to warm deserts to, wet temperate areas to wet jungle areas. It's just that where I think we need to make sure we're having the conversation is in what the expectations are for what the world will look like in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, so that we can be addressing the mindset that we need to have of what this could actually look like. What does a 5 foot or like 1.5 meters climate change event look like? And Jason, are those principles or techniques? And if those are techniques, what do we call those tactical decisions about how we answer questions like how do we get water? Those are something that came up in my permaculture education as strategies. And so how do we get water is the question that is the question that leads to the technique. And so that's where we might want to break down the language that we use when it comes to this. And so actually, let me switch back over and give you a little drawing, because this is something that came up in one of my PDCs that is probably a conversation we should have in the future. So let me pull this up real quick. Let me see if I can get my camera to focus. for me, I think of permaculture design as as a process, as right, and that idea that the questions remain the same is is like a part of our strategy of what our on the ground design looks like and what we're designing for. And so I think key to your question is that what we need to ensure we're talking about is, if we live in a temperate climate currently, what does our climate look like as it gets wetter? Um, what can we plant now that is likely to survive in this climate as it changes over time? How do we look at planning for succession over 50 years or 100 years or 150 years? How do we look at, as the ecosystems that we're engaging with move north, what do those, let me see if I can get some edge detection. What do those look like as they move up? What are the analogs that currently exist? So if I'm in Northern Virginia and I know that the climate is currently moving north at, and I used to have the figures on this, I don't have them in mind at the moment, but if I know that the climate is moving north at, say, 30 miles a decade, and I want to plan for 50 years from now, then I'm going to be looking someplace like 150 miles south of here, which, as the crow flies, I think that gets me to, like, the middle of North Carolina. So if I'm looking at something like the middle of North Carolina, what's already growing there? What's doing well on those edges that I could move here already? If I'm trying to plan for 100 years, what's 150 miles south of there? If I want to look at the way that these things are accelerating, there's I think it's the COP climate map. I forget the whole name of it, but I can drop that to you guys on the Discord and put some and include a comment on this video about it. But there's a climate map that shows like climate analogs all over the world. And so, I might draw a line from here 300 miles south to Georgia, and then look for climate analogs all over the world to start looking for species that I could bring in that would grow well here. Looking at the foodstuffs that already grow well here. But yeah, I don't think that the core questions change that much, but it's making sure that we're aware of what climate change is going to look like, and to have a realistic conversation about that, so that we can begin planning for it now and forecasting 100 or 150 years in the future, and start training people now to be tending those things. As I'm in middle age now, looking for people who are 20 years younger than me to be having these conversations with and moving that dialogue forward. But I think another sector, I think that we could also make it a principle of permaculture, or so that it occurs earlier in the conversation, or just where do we integrate it into the conversation about particular principles. And so there are lots of different ways to tackle it, and for me, I would probably put it in a conversation with the principals from like a teacher's perspective, and include climate change at every step of the way, and be addressing. It's like observe and interact. What have you observed this year? What have you observed since you are, over the last 10 years? For somebody who's lived in an area their entire lives, how different is it? Draw out some of their story and the things that they did or used to do, and maybe we can be talking about development and the way that that's changed the climate because of a heat island effect. And then, to push that edge a little bit further about that conversation, about, okay, well, what if it continues to get warmer? And part of that also is that when we have the conversation about climate change, is that we cannot present it in any skeptical way. And, I have no room for debate on climate change. Um, and so, like, there's just no room for it. And I wouldn't engage someone about whether it's real or whether it's not, or anything like that. It is just part of my class. If it's not something that you interact with, deal with it. Um, and just, yeah, include it. Um, and from our, yeah, but from our day-to-day perspective, it's just, yeah, thinking about it that far out. For you specifically, Jason, like the conversations that we've been having, and like what Julie's brought up about, like, what are the primary plants in Pittsburgh in 400 years? Like, I think that the stories that we tell now and explore in fiction and forecasting are really important, because that's the kind of stuff that we can walk back. Being, thinking about the fact that maybe we will be growing chocolate in Pennsylvania, in a few hundred years. And then, like, what does that look like? How can we plan a culture and a community for that kind of time as well? Thinking about the kind of skill set that comes in with that, okay, yeah, like, um, but yeah, like flooding. As I brought up earlier, like, how does that change? What happens if the area gets warmer, and there's more precipitation? Then, those spaces that are flatlands might become swamps. And then, do we want to take advantage of that? If, like, after living through pandemic, I'm just throwing a bunch of ideas out here because I love this kind of speculation, because this forecasting is what we can walk back from then. With, like, having gone through the pandemic and knowing that mosquitoes can be a real big issue, seeing things show up further and further north. If we have some areas that are flatland, does that mean that as they become wetter, we need to have the knowledge as part of our story that we may need to plant willows in order to make those spaces dry, because we don't want to have to deal with the pests, because we don't have insecticides or other chemicals, or just because we don't want to use those? How can we drain some of that land? Or if it is wet, are there certain things that we would like to grow there? And yeah, just having some deep conversations about what all this looks like and what we can do with it. Um, yeah. Um, do, 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 do. Let me put this. Yeah, rice. Blessed rice is really awesome, and there's some people who are doing some really cool small scale rice, um, plans, which are really neat. But what I mentioned earlier, Jason, that came up in one of my permaculture classes, which is something that I really want to work with someone who is better at doing graphic design than I'd like to have somebody put together. Um, is this idea that, like, permaculture as a practice really is kind of a descending hierarchy. Of course, I'm not. That very often the conversation gets stuck on. Let me put this together real quick. So we start up here. We have the prime directive in ethics. If I could bold these, stamp them, tattoo them on every permaculture practitioner's arm, the prime directive in ethics are what everything else come from. And the rest of these ideas descend from that. So, we start here, then we have the principles, which kind of simplify the way that we want to think about, like, what all of our needs and everything are. And as I consider your question more deeply, this is where I would put climate change, is in the principles. and I would include it on every principle, a way that climate change impacts them, and a way that we can use that principle to mitigate climate change. Then there's this third category. I wish I knew where I first encountered it. It might have been Toby Hemingway, just as like an offhand comment, is that our strategies are all the questions, are like all the other questions that we would ask in order to get to the actual on the ground techniques that we are going to need in order to implement permaculture. Even though for me, the practice of permaculture is in the prime directives and ethics, and the questions that we ask, and considering the earth and our future and other things, like, yeah, to me, permaculture practice is in the prime directive and ethics, and everything else is just an extension of that. But then, yeah, that the principles, as we go down this, the prime directive and ethics just help us to decide whether or not what we're doing is even related to permaculture and the ideas that are core to this practice. Then, when we get to the principles are our reminders of how to consider what those ethics look like in practice, and the way that we put them into practice by spending time on the land, by making sure that if we observe that we do interact by taking action. Then the strategies are the things like you asked about, how do we harvest water? What are our sources of water? And, these strategies become a long list of questions of what we then wind up putting into practice with techniques. And that the techniques then are our things, and I can't believe I'm saying these words in a conversation, things like swales and hugelkultur. These are our herb spirals, and everything else that are what we see in permaculture in practice. Raised beds, zwei, net and pan capture, the way that we might create microclimates. Once we identify them with our principles and strategies, then the way that we actually use them are our techniques. So like a spolier against a brick wall in order to grow a plant that is normally a warmer weather tree in a cooler climate. All the things that Brad Lancaster details on the ways that we actually harvest water fall into techniques. Rain barrels fall into techniques. But it's things like, catch and store energy or obtain a yield in principles become things like how can we store water? What water can we store? What are the ways we can store water? Okay, ideally we want to get it into the ground. We can use rain barrels if need be. We can get it into our plants. And then, our techniques is the actual implementation. But yeah, I really wish that we had more of a focus in our conversation on descending from that top down, and that many of our issues over where to plant our cucumbers or whether or not we should implement swales, that becomes a lot more clear when we start at the top again and work down. And there are a lot of things. There are lots of places where this does loop back up, because it's completely possible for us to want to go back to that beginning and work our way down again, because we encounter something as we're trying to use one of the principles to develop a strategy where a new question arises, and we go, okay, well, let's go back to the prime directive and ethics. Is what I'm doing the best decision to get me where I want to go? Yes or no? Am I actually engaging in care for Earth and things like that, and then flow down again? Maybe we're, wanting to decide whether swales or rain barrels are going to be our best choice for a particular property, and then we go back to the top again, and so on. So, reading back through, when I come across this, a lot of times my biggest issue with a lot of our permaculture conversation is that it focuses so much on techniques without digging deeply into our like really core practices, and not even going back to principles that often or discussing strategies. It's this like really hard technique focus on, I have to do this thing, I'm going to do this thing, how do I make it permaculture, rather than having that conversation from the top down. And I think some of that is rooted in the faults of what a permaculture education looks like. And because the PDC doesn't focus on many of the design questions and like conversational elements to move a student's learning through really reinforcing the prime directive ethics and principles first and foremost. I don't know if it was a fault of my PDC, but like when I look at the designer's manual and conversations, and in conversation with some other PDC teachers now who went through earlier PDCs, we go through the ethics and the principles in like, half a day. 4 hours of the PDC is introducing these ideas, and then we spend the rest of the class referencing them. But so much time is really spent on what it winds up looking like in the ground, because, here's how you can create a microclimate because your house is warm and dry. Here's the way that you can create a guild around an apple tree. You know, these are all the resources that you can harvest from a particular location, which is great when we might want to talk about obtain a yield, but it doesn't get us back to what yields we should be obtaining, or all the or necessarily all of the unseen yields that might exist, and winds up becoming very deeply about human use. Which, as I say, I think that in one hand, that is where our design methodology should focus on, and our conversations about permaculture design is about the fact that we are designing for human beings in our environments and where we are. But being able to talk about the other yields that we can get by being aware of the other than human. And that's something that, like, being a big fan of the work of Daniel Quinn and Ishmael, reading, as much of David Abrams' work that I can get my hands on, that we should be having more of those conversations as well early on about our relationship with the other than human and how that impacts our designs. Wanting to take them into account as part of the broader picture because of how important it is that we think about them in our designs, but also think about the ways that our designs lessen our impact on the other than human, that we can care for them in that space, but we can have a much bigger impact by minimizing the disturbance that we create in the world. Yeah. So now that I've gone on for nearly an hour and a half for this conversation about, putting together a base map and considering a zone analysis and embracing a permaculture mindset for climate change, and including climate change, that for me, the answer to that is making sure that as individual practitioners we are well informed about what the expected impacts of climate change are, and then to something that the permaculture community can do is to make sure that we include this more deeply in our permaculture education. Is there anything else that you'd like me to address today before bringing this one to an end? And as I say, I'll be doing another live stream next Sunday, the 13th, that will be about design and digging into more of this zone analysis, and then leading into a conversation about sectors and vectors, which are the sectors are our influences on a site, and Vectors were something that I haven't heard in a lot of permaculture conversations, but was something introduced in my PDC, which are sectors or influences on a site that we might want to mitigate in some way. And then we can, of course, take that conversation from there and dig in a bit deeper. Coming up in a couple of days, the next live stream is going to be on Wednesday at 9 o'clock. Let me pop this up real quick because I've got, yes, Wednesday at 9 on Wednesday, June 9th at 9 p.m. is going to be the next live stream where I'm going to go back into the conversation about children in permaculture and continue developing that in this setting. So it looks like we've got no more questions at the moment. So thank you, everybody, for joining me for the conversation today. It's been fun to play with having an extra camera to do some of the graphic stuff with you. If you have any thoughts or suggestions on how I can, develop or improve this, feel free to send me an email, show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. You can text me if you'd like or give me a call. The phone number for the show is 717-827-6266. Yeah, 717-827-6266. Also, feel free to drop me any topics that you might want discussed on a show or a live stream in the future. At the moment, I think I'm going to be doing some more of these. It's been really helpful to expand on the fact that I've been doing this for a long time, and there are a lot of different pieces that come together in this environment where we're, interacting. I'm getting your questions live, and we're able to have kind of a back and forth. So, yeah. I think this is where a lot of that's going to be. For those of you who aren't on Patreon, if you're with us, that's a good place to get involved. Patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. I'm releasing some regular polls about where to go with the show and what to work on in the weeks and days ahead. Announce when live streams are going to be. Lots of things going on over there. We've got a Patreon Discord. We're having some conversations as well. So yeah, if you want to join in, hop over and join us. Patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. But from there, thank you everyone again for joining me. And I'll catch you all again soon.